Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum and our third lecture for the 2013 Arts and Culture Series. We created the Arts and Culture Series last year to allow members of our community and beyond to share their passions and experiences with patrons and friends of the Athenaeum. It is the goal of the Athenaeum through her staff and trustees to continue serving as stewards of our culture and heritage and develop a greater exchange for learning and experience. We are pleased to host 9 lectures this year. Of particular interest, before we get started, I want to make sure everyone was aware of our largest fundraising event that we're going to be holding in May of 2013. There's a little flyer on all of your chairs. It's the Hidden Treasures Gala, and it is going to highlight several key exhibits that feature items from our collection that most people have never seen before. And there are really some amazing things. And Howard Coffin, the Civil War author, will be joining us as guest speaker, and he will be signing and introducing his new book during that event. So if you have any questions regarding that, just contact me here at the Athenaeum, and there's information regarding tickets on the back of the form. This presentation is also sponsored by the Vermont Humanities Council through its Speakers Bureau program. In addition to providing events such as this one, the Council sponsors reading and discussion programs, a variety of literacy programs, and other statewide events. The Vermont Humanities Council is dedicated to creating a state in which every individual reads, participates in public affairs, and continues to learn throughout life. This presentation is hosted by the Athenaeum. May I please ask everyone to turn off your mobile devices? Matt is in the back there, and he's recording this for us, and we will be uploading this to our YouTube page, so if you could just turn off your phones, please, that would be great. I would like to introduce Athenaeum trustee Bill Graves, who will be introducing tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Mel. Glad to see so many folks here tonight. Since Mel brought up the subject, as a trustee, I'm supposed to sell a certain number of tickets to the gala. So I brought the tickets that I'm supposed to sell, and if anybody would like to buy one, I'd be happy to sell it to them. This evening we're here to welcome Douglas Brooks for his presentation, an apprentice boat builder in Japan. Woodworking in Japan has a tradition as a craft performed with honor and has its foundation in art form. To quote, the apprentice boat builder system produced craftspeople with incomparable skills, yet required an intense devotion and seriousness. To the point even, and I continue to quote, when the apprentice is forbidden from speaking because one learns from observation and perseverance. Here in St. Johnsbury, we may know, and we may have known someone who was apprenticed to a school for violin crafting, or Maine boat building, or custom furniture, cabinet making, and Adirondack boat building. In Europe, some of the building crafts still require 7 years of observation from a student before a slate or thatch or peg is placed. Even in our Vermont, where traditions still bear some influence, I don't know of any students, apprentices, journeymen in the crafts and trades who will be silent, as the Japanese master requires, as the master here in Vermont teaches. Especially since some techniques have no written record. Let's give our attention now to Doug about a boat builder. He's of museum pieces, of replicas of North American boats. Doug is a writer, a researcher, with 2 books out, and I believe he brought a book that he could share with us. So please welcome Douglas Brooks.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks to the Athenaeum and the Vermont Humanities Council. So before we begin, I cleared this with our videographer, and it's okay to interrupt me at any point during the talk to ask questions. I find as I give these talks that often the questions that come from the audience lead the talk in better directions than I might take the talk. So with that, feel free to call out. I did bring a copy of my first book, and I'll mention it in the course of the talk. And I do sell this book. It's in English and Japanese, and you're welcome to take a look at it after the talk. And I also have my business card, so please feel free to take a card and keep in touch. So we begin with an iconic image of Japan. Probably all of you have seen this woodblock print, Great Wave off Kanazawa, and maybe you never realized that there's actually Japanese boats, traditional boats, in that image. And we're going to see boats tonight that I built that are quite similar to this. I'm going to start with a very poor homemade slide of Japan, and the bold red lines represent my travels around Japan. Japan consists of 47 prefectures, and I have traveled to all but 2 of them, primarily looking for traditional boat builders and also studying with 5 boat builders. And I'm going to just point out to set the stage tonight, because the talk is going to go chronologically through all 5 of my apprenticeships. So my first apprenticeship was on Sado Island here in the Sea of Japan. My second and third apprenticeships were in Tokyo Bay. My fourth apprenticeship, oh, it went off the screen, is right up here on the Pacific coast at the northern end of the main island. And this is the tsunami coast. Actually, the village I lived in was slightly damaged. It was at the northern edge of the tsunami zone. And then my fifth, most recent apprenticeship is not on the map. It was in Okinawa, which is way, way, way off to the south. So we'll begin with that. So in 1990, I traveled to Japan. My college roommate was from Hiroshima, and for 8 years he badgered me about coming to Japan. And I did so, and I went to the country with a very interesting photograph showing a very strange boat. And I asked my roommate when I saw him to read the caption on the photograph, and he said, all it says is Sado Island, village of Ogi. And so I got out my map and I traveled to Sado and found these boats. And these are called taraibune, which literally means tub boat. And these are still found, still used on Sado Island for fishing. It's the only place in Japan that still uses them. And you can see the conventional fishing boats in the background. But these are literally barrels that people go out to sea in. Now this man is steadying the boat with his paddle, looking down through a wooden box with a glass bottom, and when he sees the catch on the bottom, he can maneuver himself over it, and he can grab any one of these different kinds of spears. This is a great picture. That's a sazae spear, which is a little conch shell. That's an abalone spear, and that's a seaweed spear. So he's outfitted to get any of the 3 major catches that are procured from these boats. And the reason these boats survive to this day, and the reason they were very popular, is Sado, this corner of Sado, has a volcanic coastline, which you can see here. And these sharp rocks, if you can imagine this setting in any kind of a sea, any kind of a wind or waves, a conventional boat would just be smashed to pieces. But these tubboats can maneuver inshore, right up close to the rocks, where the fishermen believe actually the best catch is. These boats were also traditionally used by women. As ancient looking as they may seem, they were only introduced about 125 years ago, when somebody cut a barrel in half, threw it in the water, and figured out you could use it as a boat. And when that was done, it changed the fishing economy of this part of the island, and father kept the conventional fishing boat, but now mother could go fishing. So traditionally these boats are used by women, and to this day most of the fisher persons using tubboats are women. It is classic Japanese barrel making, and one of the really interesting features of it is the braided bamboo hoops. That's split bamboo, intricately braided, that holds the boats together. And if you go to Sado Island, there is a tourist company where women, only women, dressed up in what's considered the traditional Sado Island clothing will give you a ride. And my first teacher was very proud of the fact that he built the first glass-bottomed tugboat, and these school children are looking down through a glass window in the bottoms of the boats. And the reason this kind of fishing works, and this kind of fishing of spearing things off the bottom is quite common in Japan, and you get an idea of the clarity of the water. And you also notice that this woman, who's very elderly, is paddling from the bow of the boat. These boats are propelled from the front. So in the sculling motion with the paddle, you're pushing water underneath the boat and pulling yourself forward. It's not easy. And the thing that gets me about that photo is she's probably in her 70s or 80s, and she's doing that one-handed, and I have yet to be able to do that one-handed. So it's a very skilled thing. And also the boats are not round, they are oval. And in one village, and it's men only, does that surprise anyone? The men in one village put outboard motors on their tugboats. But you notice the way they steer. The paddle is out in front of the boat. It kind of terrifies me. But yeah, so these men, and it was explained to me that for some reason this is not considered a decent fishing ground, and that the men in this village have to travel. They have to go about a mile down the coast, and that's why they put outboard motors on their tugboats. And so on that very first trip, I happened to meet this man, who at the time I met him in 1990 was the last builder of tugboats. And I went back in 1992 and 1994, and along with native speakers as translators, I did oral interviews with him. And in 1994, on my third visit, he invited me to be his apprentice. In Japan, the crafts, to this day, are handed down from master to apprentice. You find, in the traditional crafts, you find little, if any, written material documenting the crafts. We take for granted, if I want to learn how to knit, I can go to YouTube, I can go to the internet, I can find a book, and I can learn how to knit. That same thinking, that same reality really largely doesn't exist in Japan. If you want to learn how to do some kind of special dyeing of kimono fabric, it is just understood in Japanese culture that you must find a master. No one will look at you and say, go get a book, find a YouTube video, etc., take a class. And so this is the kind of world I was suddenly thrown in. And I jumped at the opportunity when my teacher, Mr. Fuji, invited me to be his apprentice, and he had never had an apprentice. I was his sole apprentice, and actually, I'm the sole apprentice of all 5 craftspeople you'll see tonight. Mr. Fuji's father and grandfather were coopers. These are miso tubs, and these tubs, to give you an idea of scale, these tubs are about 10 feet tall and 12 feet in diameter. And they are as much as 100 years old. And miso is fermented soybean paste, which is a product on Sado Island and throughout Japan. And the very finest miso is fermented in wood. Most miso is today fermented in stainless steel. But this company still works in wood with wooden vats. And my teacher, actually his early career, he apprenticed with his father in the miso workshop, factory workshop, and his job mainly was repairing these vats, but most importantly replacing these hoops, because the bamboo hoops would periodically wear out. The tubs themselves would last 100 years, but the hoops would last 5 to 10 years. So he was really a master of the making of the braided bamboo hoops. So I went back for my apprenticeship, and as the man who introduced me alluded, the very first day on the job, Mr. Fuji, we walked into the workshop, he pointed to a little stool and he said, "Sit." And I sat down. And it was a great vantage point to photograph him, because he worked all day planing the staves of our tugboat that we were building together. Like most Japanese craftsmen, seated on the floor. The workbench is just a block of wood at his feet. His feet were clamps. He could hold the materials with his feet, and he began planing staves. And I sat there for 8 hours, and I watched him, and he worked in complete silence. He never looked at me. He never said anything to me. And at the end of the day, he jumped up, and he pointed at the shavings, and he said, "Clean," and he walked out of the shop. And I started, when I got all the shavings cleaned up, I was taking them to the burn barrel, which he had in the backyard, and he came rushing out of the house and he said, "No, that heats the bath." So that night's bath was heated with the shavings from the day's work. And so I went into the shop the second day, and he pointed to the stool and said, "Sit." And I sat. It was a great vantage point to photograph him. And he worked making staves. And it was either on the second day, I may have sat an entire day the second day. So either late in the second day or the third day, I was watching him make staves, and he suddenly jumped up, handed me the plane, and said, "Work." And he walked out of the shop. And so I took his place on the floor, and I'd been watching him, and I began to plane staves, and I thought he went outside to have a cigarette, but he never came back. And my wife told me later at the end of the day that she found him taking a nap. And he was gone for about 3 hours, and he reappeared in the shop, and he went to my pile of staves, and he went through it, and he said, "Good, good, bad, bad, good, bad, good, bad." And when he finished going through my pile, he pointed to the bad pile, and he said, "Fix," and he walked out of the shop for the rest of the day. And so, just to encapsulate, and this is a subject that really fascinates me, that in the Japanese apprenticeship, the apprentice is expected, maybe he's sweeping. Very commonly, apprentices are sharpening, and that's all they're doing is sharpening tools. Definitely cleaning, keeping the shop clean. But at all times, they are expected to be paying attention to what the teacher is doing. Because one day, the teacher is going to say, "Now it's your turn." And you are expected to know how to do it and do it correctly the first time you're asked. It's really quite ironic that I went to Japan as an apprentice barely speaking Japanese, and yet I didn't have to speak Japanese because within that context there is no speaking. And this has been true of all of my studies in Japan, that there's almost been almost no give and take, no back and forth. Do it like this, no, do it like this. The way we teach in the West, it has all been simply, watch me, now do it. And it's sink or swim. And I must admit to you, it really focuses your attention. It's a really fascinating, we could take an entire evening just to talk about that, the nature of craft learning in Japan. Very similar to Buddhist monastic training, which I'm convinced it's completely related to. So the toughest part of building tugboats is the bamboo hoops, at least for me. The woodworking is not that challenging, but so we cut down 55-foot tall stalks of timber bamboo, split them 4 ways, then split each those strips again, and then shape those strips using a draw knife. He's pulling the strip over a piece of bamboo as a fence, and he's holding the other end of the draw knife with his foot. And by the way, pulling that strip of bamboo as fast as he can, and then braiding into hoops. And here again was an enormous challenge for me as a student. I took a video camera, and the day we did the hoops, I was also helped by my wife, who is a former basket maker and had an understanding for weaving and braiding and those sorts of things. And I videotaped him and my own efforts to make hoops. And I probably, back in America with little bits of plastic strapping, I probably watched my video 100 times, but I finally figured it out. And that is probably the rarest skill I know, because there may not be more than a dozen people in Japan that know how to do this. Traditional coopering, barrel making has almost disappeared in Japan. In fact, I was in Japan in September, and I visited the last factory in the country that makes traditional sake barrels. 8 foot tall, wooden barrels. And actually the owner told me that he was going out of business. So, and this is a very poor quality image, but that's the tugboat that my teacher and I built together. I never saw my teacher again. He died in an accident a couple of years after my apprenticeship. And as his only student, you know, it sort of fell on me, or I felt a sense of responsibility to try to continue this craft. Luckily, a foundation on Sado Island contacted me and said, Mr. Fuji has passed away and you were his only student. How can we save this craft? And I said, well, we'll do the traditional thing and we'll do the modern thing. The traditional thing is I'll teach an apprentice. And so this is my apprentice, a carpenter from Sado Island, and he and I built 2 tugboats together. But then I told the foundation we'll do the modern Western thing and we'll publish a book. And so this book, and you're free to take a look at this later, this book is basically a how-to book on how to build these boats. And it's in English and Japanese, and if we want to see the world have more people braiding bamboo hoops, I have a lovely step-by-step schematic of how you braid bamboo barrel hoops. So it's all in here. And interestingly, too, from the standpoint of documentation, my tugboat drawings in this book are the first published drawings of a tugboat that I know of, and maybe still the only published drawings of a tugboat. So this is the kind of thing we're all familiar with in the West. And in Japan, this is all but unheard of. So, and this is my own tugboat here in Vermont. This is out on Kingsland Bay in Ferrisburg. If you're ever out on Lake Champlain and you see me, I have heard the rub-a-dub-dub joke, so you don't have to try that. You will not be the first one to say that to me. But anyway, I do have a tugboat, and well, I don't know. If you get over to Virgins, look me up. Maybe we can go for a ride. My second apprenticeship in Tokyo Bay was building one of these boats. This is a traditional seaweed gathering boat. This is the community of Urayasu, which is just east of Tokyo. It's the first town east of Tokyo. And we're looking out the Sakai River, and that's Tokyo Bay in the background. If you go to this spot today, the shoreline of Tokyo Bay is 1.4 miles further out. This fishing ground has been completely filled in, and from this spot, looking out, you see Tokyo Disneyland. This was one of the most important fishing communities in Japan until chemical spills in the 1970s destroyed the fishing. Developers bought the rights to the fishing grounds and then filled them in, and then this suburban development began. This photograph, you're looking at what there were 1,800 registered fishing boats in Urayasu at the time this photograph was taken. And any guesses, just glancing at these photos? And just a hint, downtown Tokyo is about 6 miles away from where these photos are taken. Any idea, any guesses as to what era these pictures were taken? These are all wooden boats. No? 1930s. That's a good guess. I remember the first time I saw these pictures, I was thinking, you know, 1910. Okay, you're getting wise to us. 1964. But by 1972, these boats were bulldozed into piles and burned. And so this whole tradition was just lost. And here's some of these seaweed boats out on Tokyo Bay. Now, my teacher was the last surviving boat builder of Urayasu. And the city of Urayasu built a folk history museum and created Japan's first and only museum boat shop inside the museum. And you see my teacher's father's tools, which he donated. They're in the display cases. But we were in a boat shop, and I had met Mr. Utagawa and just told him a little bit about my work and my desire to study and document Japanese boat building. And he told the museum he was chosen to build a traditional boat for the opening of the new museum. And he said, I won't do it unless I teach someone. It's a waste of my time unless I teach someone, and I want to teach the American. So I got a phone call, and I was told to be in Japan in 3 weeks. And Mr. Utagawa and I built this boat together. A little bit about documentation. Some Japanese boat builders use drawings. This is a copy of Mr. Utagawa's drawing. The only problem with this drawing is you can't build a boat from it. There is important information missing. And for those of you who don't, you see the profile of the boat, and you see the half view of the bottom of the boat, and you even see a half view of the transom. But what you don't know is how wide is the boat at this chine, and how wide is the boat at the gunwale. And if you ask a Japanese boat builder, as I have done many times, well, where's the missing information? The answer is, or why is there missing information? The answer is, those are my secrets. And so, ironically, you can go to a Japanese maritime museum and see hundreds, if not thousands, of these boat drawings. And you can't build a boat from any of them. Because without the builder, the information is gone. And so there's a very interesting Japanese phrase, Nusumi Gekko. We have one native speaker, my friend Sachiko is here, Nusumi Gekko. How would you translate that?
Stealing practice.
Stealing practice. I call it stolen lessons.
Okay.
Nusumu is the verb to steal. And that is a phrase, if you ever get to Japan and meet a traditional craftsman, say, Nusumi Gekko desu ka? Do you know Nusumi Gekko? And you will hear some amazing stories. Because very often, unless you apprenticed with your father or an uncle or something like that, your own teacher didn't teach you everything. And for 3 of my 5 teachers, they were in that situation where they, the apprentice, had to steal their master's secrets in order to become full masters themselves. And there are some amazing stories of initiative and devilishness about stealing secrets. This particular teacher told me that what he did was he used to get his master drunk. And he said he got his master drunk enough, and in conversation with him while drunk, he got the secret dimensions out of him. So, a bit about Japanese boat building. Almost all Japanese boats are built upright on the floor. You know, again, no workbenches, no sawhorses of any kind, built down low on the floor. And the boat shop itself is an important tool because there's very few clamps are used like we use in the West. So everything is braced overhead. So the overhead beams of a boat shop have to be very, very strong. And it gets crazy. We're putting the first plank on our seaweed boat, and you see this forest of props. If you look closely, there's actually props pushing against props. And then the boat's starting to come together. You'll notice these mortises that run down the length of the top plank. Japanese boats, unlike the West, in the West, like the siding on a house, the fastenings go through the planking into a frame. Most Japanese boats don't have frames, and so the planks are actually edge-nailed to each other. So there is a curved nail. The head of it is in the base of each of these mortises, and that curved nail is nailing that top plank to that bottom plank. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Our launching ceremony, all such ceremonies around boat building in Japan, and all the building crafts actually are Shinto-based. And so this is not a priest actually, but the former head fisherman of Urayasu officiated our launching ceremony.
Excuse me, what does Shinto-based mean?
Oh, Shinto-based, sorry. Shinto is the sort of native Japanese religion. Buddhism came over from China later, but Shintoism is the worship of spirits that are believed to reside in all things, both animate and inanimate. So, I like to show this picture. That's a brand new chisel on the bottom, and that's 2 of my teacher's chisels above. And that, if anything demonstrates a lifetime of hard work, it's sharpening that much steel over the course of your career. My teacher built 300 of those seaweed boats in his career, and about 100 other larger boats. And he had a few employees. And it's interesting talking about secrecy. We made wooden patterns to help us set angles in our boat. And at the end of the project, my teacher burned them. And I said, Mr. Utagawa, you built 300 of these boats. Did you burn the patterns every time? And he looked at me and he said, every time. Yeah. Yeah, Urayasu, being such an important fishing village, had 6 boat building companies. And they were in fierce competition with each other. So this was taken very seriously. This is just an example of my work. So for instance, when I'm working with my teachers, this is actually an example of my Tokyo teacher. It's a cross-section of a boat, and all these dimensions he had memorized. So though he had a drawing as well, it was incomplete. So my role as apprentice/researcher is to write down the dimensions. So this is all the stuff in his head, and I'm putting it all down on paper. And these are just some examples of my other drawings, just construction details, how the boats are put together. This chisel, we'll talk about the nailing now. This chisel is a special kind of chisel for setting these nails. You don't use a drill, but you actually cut the holes because the nails are not wire nails. They're flat steel with the head bent to one side. These are handmade, blacksmith made, and as of right now, there is only one company in all of Japan still making boat building nails. So that's another pressure on the craft, is that the crafts that support the craft are disappearing. So it's a very tragic situation. And so what you do to edge join planking is you cut a mortise that the nail will travel into. The head will bottom out there at the base of the mortise. The nail will come out through the middle of the plank, that rectangular hole. All that's been cut with chisels. And then the nail will pass through into the adjoining plank. This is a cutaway. And you see the slight bend to the nail? That's apprentice work. Sitting on the floor, bending hundreds of nails for your teacher. So that's basically how planks are edge nailed in Japanese boat building. And here's my teacher, my Tokyo teacher and I, and he's cutting the pilot holes in one plank edge, and I'm chiseling the other plank edges. And another very unique feature of Japanese boat building, these are saws specific to Japanese boat building, and Japanese boats are built without any caulking whatsoever. It's a wood-to-wood watertight fit. In fact, it's considered an enormous embarrassment if the boat leaks upon launch, even a drop. And so Japanese boat builders, what they do is they put the parts of the boat, in this case pieces of a plank, on the shop floor, and they run a saw cut down the seam between them. Now, if you're a woodworker, you're probably familiar with this. It's more like a trick. If 2 pieces of wood don't fit and you run a saw down between them, you cut 2 parallel sides. And then once you've run your saw through, those 2 pieces should fit better. And if you saw it again, the more times you saw it, the better the fit you'll get. Well, Japanese boat builders fit every seam in the boat with this method. And they use these special saws, and it's a very, very painstaking process. So you see the 2 planks for our boat, and each plank is composed of 3 pieces of wood that we're going to edge nail together, and you see that we have been sawing down those seams. And I would say for that boat, those 2 planks, that's more than 2 days' work sawing only with those hand saws. Back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And you have a series of saws, and you move from a more aggressive sawtooth to a finer sawtooth to the finest sawtooth. And the result is this is 2 pieces of wood, and the seam is right at the apex of that's 2 pieces of wood nailed together. And yes, or I should say, no, you can't see the seam. So it's a really remarkable technique. In the West, we bend wood in boat building using steam, put the wood in a steam box, take it out, bend it. In Japan, and all of Asia actually, you bend wood over an open fire. And here we are in Tokyo bending some actually rub rails for our boat. All my teachers use patterns. These patterns, my teacher, he only labeled these for my benefit. These normally patterns are never labeled. So if they fall into somebody else's hands, that person doesn't know how to use them. And my teacher's setting that pattern, it gave him the bevel on the edge of the plank. And here's our boat. You see the charring there from the bending process. Later, that was my job to clean that up with a plane. But you see the props. Again, this is Tokyo, my third apprenticeship. And my teacher's baler. Just an exquisite piece of woodworking. Just to bail a boat. He was very, very proud of that. And he told me, he was a fourth generation boat builder, and he said, that is the Fujiwara baler. And that has not changed in 4 generations. So just some shots of the Tokyo boat. If you do get to Tokyo, let me know, because this project was actually funded by the Freeman Foundation from here in Vermont. And the Freemans donated this boat to a rowing club in downtown Tokyo, and they teach the public how to use the Japanese sculling oar. And they will happily take you for a ride in that boat, and definitely mention my name. I'm quite popular with this group because we provided them a brand new boat. And that's the Japanese sculling oar, very directly related to the Chinese sculling oar. The Chinese, no doubt, invented it. But a very powerful way to move a boat. And I do show this photograph. This is actually, I had nothing to do with the construction of this boat. I visited here. This is actually a traditional Japanese whale boat for chasing whales. But I like to show the picture because that shows multiple sculling oars on a single boat. Most fishing boats in Japan, just the one oar off the stern. But in some cases, for very high speed, the Japanese will put multiple sculling oars. And that's a beautiful, beautiful replica from the town of Muroto, which is a famous old whaling town in Japan.
What's the wood that they're using there, and is it similar to any of the woods that we would know?
Almost all the boats you're seeing here today are built of Japanese cedar. Sugi, it's called. And Sugi, it's like North American cedars in terms of density. The Japanese have beautiful old-growth forests, so they have huge trees available to them. I don't know if you appreciate how wide some of these planks are that I'm working with. Then the other woods, hinoki is a hardwood, it's Japanese cypress, and that's another common boat-building wood, but really just those two. Yeah. And then some oak, just a little bit of, surprisingly, not much oak used in Japanese boat building. The sculling oars are made of oak. So. This is my fourth teacher way up in northern Japan, and we built a fishing boat. Again, this was also part of the Freeman Foundation. He used no drawings whatsoever, memorized the key dimensions, and he had a handful of patterns. Again, bending the planking. In this case, he used charcoal instead of an open fire. And the saw fitting technique. This is maybe a better image of it. So note, the 2 garboard planks are propped only, against the keel plank, and my teacher is moving on down that seam with the saw. The transom is mounted at the bow. You can't see it. The stem is mounted. Now you can see the stem. I'm there working the other plank seam, and my teacher is using the saw to fit the plank into that rabbet joint at the stem. Just painstaking work. I mean, that took 2 of us easily all day to do those 2 planks. And actually, this one's done. We've nailed it on, and we're over on the other side. And there's a look at that boat. First 2 planks on, with 2 more planks to go. And up in northern Japan, the boats do have frames. And they use these natural grown crooks of wood. These are just rough cut at that point and waiting to be fitted into the boat. In northern Japan, and amazingly, the village I found myself in had the greatest amount of carving on the fishing boats. And it was the one thing my teacher would not allow me to do. He said, the carving is my signature. and only I will do the carving. However, as the apprentice, oh, sorry, I'm a little out of sequence. This is an example of a wooden squid boat. This is the largest boat that my teacher ever built in his career. He mostly built the kind of boat that he and I built in the apprenticeship. But my job as apprentice was to paint all the carving. This was without a doubt the most uncomfortable apprenticeship I had. My teacher was not very nice to me. Now that's actually well known in Japan, that there's a phrase kibishi, which means strict. And if you ask Japanese people about traditional crafts, they'll generally look at you with fear, because it's just kind of understood that these apprenticeships are brutal. This guy provided me that historic experience. It was really tough to work with him. I thought it was going to be a very long summer. And finally one day at lunch I asked him, I said, "Mr. Ando, tell me about your apprenticeship." And he began to describe it. And his apprenticeship, he actually fled after 3 years. He was never paid, was completely unpaid. And the normal boat building apprenticeship is 6 years. And he just finally, it was so awful, so brutal, his teacher was so mean to him that he just split after 3 years. And it sort of put everything in perspective. It's like, oh, that's why he's treating me this way. Because that's the only way, you know, that was his model of the, quote, teacher-master relationship. So it was really quite odd, because as soon as the workday ended, I would go home, you know, holding my forehead like a day of abuse, and get home. And 30 minutes later, he'd show up at my apartment and say, "Can I take you and your wife out to dinner?" He was just a different person in the shop than outside the shop. I'm sorry, did you have a question?
I wanted to ask if there was some sort of a being held in contempt almost by the master for your your ignorance and your amateurishness
Well, there's no, you know, it obviously depends on the person, right? So the personalities. But, you know, the expectation, what's really interesting about Japanese crafts is versus, like I teach in this country. I teach boat building and other sorts of things. And it's interesting how when I teach a class, I have to admit this, I'm not proud of it, but how much my own ego is invested in the success of my students. If anybody's a teacher here, I'm sure you can identify with that. You want your teachers to succeed, right? Make you look better. And what you realize in the Japanese system is the teacher feels no responsibility for the student. If I'm your teacher, whether you succeed or fail is entirely up to you. I'm just here working, right? It's an amazing role reversal. It's really, really fascinating. I'm probably going off on a tangent and missing your question. But the result of it is that, yeah, it's very easy for a teacher to maybe not necessarily hold in open contempt, but there's certainly no coddling in that kind of relationship, because the teacher doesn't need you. You know what I mean? So it's sink or swim. It's a real feeling of sink or swim. And it really feels like the responsibility is entirely on the student. There's no way you raise your hand in the apprenticeship in Japan and say, "I had a crummy teacher." That's unthinkable. So, just some details of some of the beautiful, simple, rustic carving. And these are all very important spiritual motifs. And again, my job to paint them. And this was kind of funny. I asked my teacher, and I'm going to make Sachiko read this for us, but she doesn't have to read the whole thing. But I asked my teacher if he signed his boats, and he said, "No, I don't sign my boats, my carving and my signature. Everyone will know it's my boat when they see my carving." And then right at the end of the project, he scrawled this, and my name's up there. It says America, and then Douglas Brooks, and blah, blah, blah. And then his name and address are basically up there. Ando Seizo and stuff. And I said, well, wait a sec, I thought you said you didn't sign your boats. And he said, I cover that all up, and nobody knows it's there but us. And now I've told all of you. So we put the carving over that and hid that forever. My first teacher, my tugboat teacher, before we put the staves of the tugboat together, he wrote little sayings on the edge. And he never told his customers that he wrote little poems and little phrases. And I found that elsewhere in Japan. Nobody putting their actual name, but just putting their mark somewhere. And then our boat launching ceremony was just my teacher and I. He didn't invite my wife. He didn't invite his own wife. And we just, and that's okay. I've actually done that. I've been part of that too, where just the boat builder conducts the ceremony. Some rice, some salt, some sake, you're good. And that's our boat upon delivery. And the Freeman Foundation donated this boat to a local maritime museum. I went back in my journal later and realized that the carvings on this boat represented 1/6 of the total labor. And I actually asked my teacher about that, because this is a fishing boat. This is a fishing boat. That's it. And I said that to him. I said, you know, this strikes me as a bit odd that we devoted that much time to the carving. And he looked at me, and this is 2003, and this is modern day Japan, and he looked at me and he said, no fisherman in this village would go to sea in a boat without those carvings. And I couldn't send a fisherman to sea in a boat without those carvings, because those carvings protect him. And if you go to Japan, and 99% of the tourists who go to Japan just go to the cities, I hope you can get out to the countryside, because there is just such rich, rural, earthy beliefs that still survive in the Japanese countryside, and really well worth experiencing. It's like another country entirely.
Tell me about the stern of that. Is that put up for a motor?
Yeah, that's a great observation. So you notice, unlike Western boats, the transom is inset. The planks run past the transom and create this cavern in the back of the boat. And I've gotten two different answers for why the boats have this. Fishermen say it creates a protected place for a motor or a propeller, you know, to run. But the boat builders say, if you put the plank right to the edge flush to the transom like we do in the West, and you put a nail through it, it could split. So you run the planks past, and that way the planks will never split, which is a brilliant answer. Anyway, yes?
Why do you need the salt and the other stuff for the launching ceremony?
Okay, good question. So Shintoism, a little bit about Shintoism, it's a religion very focused on purity, purification. And so salt is considered a purifier. Sake is very symbolic because it comes from rice, which is the staple food in Japan. Sachiko, please feel free to chime in if you want to contribute anything to this. But real briefly, a boat launching ceremony honors two gods. Yama no Kami, the god of the mountain, because that's where the wood came from, and Umi no Kami, the god of the sea, where the boat is going. And so everything is in twos. So if there are gifts at the boat launching ceremony, it'll always be pairs, 2 fish, 2 oranges, 2 bottles of sake. And like in the West, you know, we break a bottle of champagne on the boat to launch it. They pour sake on the boat. And depending where you are in Japan, they'll have different theories about where you pour the sake. Pour it on the bow, pour it on the stern. I did a boat launching where they poured it on either side of the boat. But that's all local, just a local thing. So salt is a purification. And one of the amusing things is when you have a Shinto priest officiate your boat launching, one of the things they purify are the boat builders. And it takes a lot of purification. But anyway, so.
You know better than I.
Oh, really?
Impressed.
Yes.
Is there any kind of finish on the boats?
Yeah, all the boats you've seen have been unfinished, except bottoms have gotten bottom paint. That Tokyo boat had bottom paint. And no, traditionally boats were completely unfinished. You know, if you go to Japan, the temples are unfinished, traditional homes. No, paint was not an available commodity. But the cedar and the cypress, they weather. They do weather. So then bottom paint came in first, and boats got bottom paint. And today, you know, fishermen, even wooden boats, they paint them. But my teachers were working in a very traditional manner. My most recent apprenticeship was in Okinawa, and this is a photograph from the top of a mountain on the little tiny island where I was living and studying, Iejima, and that's the main island of Okinawa in the background. And I was here to learn from one of only 3 craftsmen left in all of Okinawa. They're all in their 80s, who can still build the sabani. Now, Okinawa is a totally different culture than Japan. It's the Ryukyu culture, the Ryukyu kingdom. And in the 1860s, the Japanese basically took Okinawa. So Okinawa is not Japanese culture. It's Okinawan culture. And Okinawans will tell you that, should you make the mistake and infer anything else. And so the sabani is the iconic traditional fishing boat. And what's so interesting about this is the first traditional boat in Japan to be discovered as a sport and as a pleasure boat. And so if there's hope for a revival of Japanese boat building, it's going to be here in Okinawa. And these boats are being actively raced now. They were fishing boats. My teacher built 100 sabani after World War II before switching to a more modern, conventional Japanese-style boat. And about 10 years ago, these sabani racers came to him and said, you know, can you build us a sabani? And he hadn't built a sabani in like 30 years. And he said to me, when they asked me, I thought to myself, do I remember all the dimensions? And he grabbed a piece of plywood and he sketched a sabani and he wrote down all the dimensions. This is the first example I've seen of a Japanese boat builder writing down his secret dimensions. And I took that and ran to the copy store and laid that on a copy machine with his permission. So those are the dimensions. This is what he built his first 100 sabani with. He made this adze from the leaf spring of a U.S. Army Jeep. And this teacher didn't get electric power till 1964. So he built his first 100 sabani entirely by hand. We use power tools. So the sabani, these 2 side planks are 2 inches thick, almost 3 feet wide, and 26 feet long. Big wood, okay? Now, got to look closely at this picture. We have hollowed those 2 planks. So they're symmetrical to each other. That's been left full thickness at the gunnel, the top edge of the plank, the boat, for strength. We have hollowed it to half its depth, 1 inch. Then it's full thickness, this strip here, which is going to support the seats when we're all done. And then it's hollowed again, and then it flares back up to full thickness for where that's going to connect to the bottom of the boat. This is called a semi-dugout. So this is a dugout is carved from a single tree. This is a modification of the dugout style. It's kind of in between dugout, true dugout boat building, and plank boat building. And the exact same thing happened all around the world, but it's still being done in Okinawa. So this is my teacher's son. He's a fisherman, and he helped us quite a bit on the project. We spent 3 days bending the 2 side planks. We did build this boat upside down. There we are bending. My teacher's we temporarily fastened turnbuckles between the 2 planks, and we had spreading bars, and we slowly, painstakingly bent the 2 side planks to shape. And then, using a chain fall on an overhead cable, we dropped this, 500-pound chunk of cedar for our bottom. And we began, that's looking underneath the boat, the spreader bars, the turnbuckles. And we began fitting, removing it, and shaping it the bottom, and then putting it back on the boat. My teacher's scribing the fit again, take it off again, do more shaping. He said in the old days he could get a big enough piece of wood to do the bottom in one piece, but we had to use 3 pieces. A center piece, and now we're fitting one of the side chunks. There's the bottom on the left, all carved, completely carved to shape, and there's our side planks on the right, waiting. Now, one of the main reasons I wanted to study Okinawan boat building is these boats are assembled with no metal fastenings whatsoever. They're held together with these. These are dovetail keys, made of hardwood, and here's how you do it. So you see the seam between the 2 planks. You put your dovetail key down, you carefully trace it out. You use a drill to get rid of most of the wood, and then you start carving with a chisel. Now you have to look closely. I carved to the line at the 4 corners. But if you look closely, I carved inside the line, a tapered inside the line to the waist. Does everybody see the pencil lines? Mm-hmm. So I left material there. And then of course I'll carve the bottom and top edge. When you drive the hardwood key in, though that little bit that I left acts like 4 wedges and sucks the 2 planks together. That can take a moment to get your head around that. But if you think about it, as that hardwood key goes in there, that material is going to force this plank this way and this plank this way. So you fit it top and bottom, and you want a loose fit, because otherwise that would hold the 2 planks apart. So you make sure you got a nice loose fit. You dip it in mother's soybean oil for lubrication, and then you pound it in. And then you plane it, you plane it flush. So those are the 3 bottom timbers. These are spaced 1 shaku, I'll talk about shaku in a moment, 1 shaku apart, and inside the boat, in between each of those, is a corresponding dovetail key. And there I am now carving the mortises for the dovetail keys, or butterfly keys, whatever you want to call them, that connect that bottom, that huge bottom, to the side planks. Yeah, it's pretty neat. That finish, by the way, is traditional Okinawa. In Okinawa, they use shark liver oil to finish the boats. Very difficult to get now. Very, very difficult to get. An elderly man donated a couple gallons of shark liver oil for our boat. But you see the dovetail keys. And then the boat, we put it in the slings, and we rolled it over, and I began to put the keys on the inside. A little bit about shaku. I mentioned shaku. In Japan, Japan is metric, like Europe and most of the world. But the traditional Japanese carpenters, house carpenters, boat builders, and other craftspeople use the traditional measuring system called shaku. Shaku sun bu. And it's a decimal system. 1 shaku is divided into 10 sun. Each sun is divided into 10 bu. Now, we're not used to decimal-based systems. I don't know about you guys, but I still can't get my head around metric. Technically, shaku is illegal in Japan. But interestingly, all kimono are made in shaku. And all tatami are made in shaku. They just refuse to give it up. In the cities, houses are metric. You get on the countryside and the carpenters are working in shaku. But here's the beauty of it for all of us. 1 shaku is 11 and 15/16 inches. So I don't know if you're like me, but if somebody says something's 4.5 meters, I can't figure that out. But if somebody says something's 20 shaku, just a little bit less than 20 feet. So shaku is an easy thing for me to use. And the funny thing about Japan is that no one under the age of 60 knows what shaku is in Japan. Would you say, Sachiko?
No, I never used.
Okay. Yeah, people in Japan often ask me how tall I am, because I'm pretty tall. And I always like to answer, well, I'm you know, they all know it in centimeters, and I say, well, I'm rokushaku isum gobu. And that really throws people, that I would know it and I would understand it. It's a great icebreaker with boat builders. So looking around, I remember that was 39 dovetail keys inside the boat, and that took me exactly 1 day to do.
What do you do with the dog holes after? Do you fill them? The dogs that you use to hold the planks?
You put a plug in any of those holes. Yeah, you just plug, yeah. Now, you can't talk about Okinawa without talking about World War II. This is really quite interesting. The island I was on, that first photo I showed you, I was on top of this mountain when I took that photograph. This island, just 3 miles wide and 4 miles long, was the scene of one of the bloodiest battles, the Battle of Okinawa. Ernie Pyle was killed on this island. He was the famous war correspondent. And the reason the Americans fought so hard for the island was there were 2 runways. So there was a ready-built airfield. And that's what the Americans wanted, and that's what the Japanese wanted to prevent them from getting. These are a pair of P-47 Thunderbolts, American fighter planes, and you see these tanks. These are drop tanks. So Americans pioneered this use of a droppable gas tank. It extended the plane's range, but if you got in a dogfight, you could just release it to gain maneuverability. So by the thousands, these tanks fell on Okinawa. And the Okinawan fishermen turned them into boats. This is an amazing legacy of World War II. And you see many other examples of this in Okinawa. And the word for boat, by the way, is fune. You combine it with another noun, and you have to turn the F into a B, so it's bune. These are called, in Japanese, tanko bune, tank boat. And this is in the local museum on the island, and I saw these all over Okinawa. I saw these with engines in them, okay? And I was in my little guest house on the island, and the mayor came over, because I was the only foreigner on the island, so the mayor decided to take a look at me. And we got chatting about tanko bune, and he said, you want to go meet a friend of mine? He still goes out in his tanko bune. And I said, you got to be kidding me. He goes, no, get in my car. And we met this man. And we sat down. He was 93 years old. And the mayor said, I told the American that, you still go fishing in your tanko bune. And he looked at me and he said, the mayor's lying. I haven't been out in my tanko bune since I was 91. And they were considered really dangerous. They were considered very unstable. He told me specifically, no fishermen ever let their children go out in them. And they were only used in really shallow water to fish for octopus. But he could very well be the last fisherman to ever use one. Anyway, back to our boat, the bow transom, and we sawed those cedar spikes off later, but you see the dovetail keys in the bow transom. This was a sailing boat. We built it as a sailing boat, so the mast partners are going in, and here's my teacher. I'm working on the seats, the bailer. And my teacher, like my other teacher, he said, this is my signature. That's carved from a single block of hard pine. Absolutely beautiful. And these boats are notoriously difficult to sail. And Okinawan fishermen learned techniques for how to bail them, how to right them and bail them, because I call sailing a sabani a cross between windsurfing and log rolling. Because I went sailing, and my sailing trip lasted about 1 minute. And I found myself in the South China Sea. They are really difficult to sail. And so my teacher explained to me, he said, see the curvature of the bottom of that bailer? It fits the bottom of our boat. And to this day, the traditional sabani races that the fishermen conduct, part of the race is you have to tip your boat over. So that skill was so valued in Okinawa that to this day they practice it. My teacher's father was a fisherman, and he told me a story that his father was out alone one day and killed a 14-foot shark. He was alone, he couldn't get it into the boat. And eventually he figured out how to do it. He rolled his boat over, he capsized his boat, and he brought it up under the shark. Got in, bailed the boat out, had the shark in the boat. This is our launching. This is a shaman. The traditional Okinawan religion is female-based, only women. And there are 2 levels of shaman, a Noro, it's the highest level, and a Yuta. And that's a Noro in training. And she was the only, we didn't have a Noro on our island. She was like 93 years old and was a Yuta in training. And she came over and did, in training. And she did our ceremony for us. A couple of Shinto motifs though, because that's a bowl of rice, and down below her is sake, and she also had salt. So there were these Shinto motifs, but she assured me this is not Shintoism. This is Okinawan religion.
So they do the blessing of the boat before it even goes in the water?
Yes, yeah. There isn't the thing like in the West. I remember one time I was at a boat launching in Japan, and they were launching it bow first. And now in the West, that's considered bad luck. We launch our boats stern first, okay? And, superstitions, right? And so this ceremony was full of superstitions, just full of superstitions. So I thought I'd contribute that. And I said to the boat builder, it's bad luck to launch things bow first. And he looked at me and he said, no, it isn't. That's all right, so everyone has their own superstitions, but that was our launching. And like I say, this boat is on its way to capsizing. This is at one of the Sabani races. They're paddled and sailed. Their longest race is 35 miles open ocean. And there are currently 50 Sabani teams. And you'll notice if you look closely, some of these are new boats, and most of them are actually old boats. So what's happened is that surfers and kayakers and board paddlers and windsurfers and the like have seized on this boat as the next adventure sport. It's a really wonderful phenomenon in Japan because it's brought 3 80-year-old craftsmen out of retirement, and they're building boats. And I'm finishing a book manuscript on how to build Sabani. Yes?
Does shark liver oil smell?
Shark liver oil smells so bad. Actually, my teacher told me, he said, they gave it up. It was hard to get, but he said it also ticked off the neighbors. Yeah, I mean, it is a horrible, horrible smelling thing. Just horrible. That's my last slide from Okinawa. I'm just going to digress a little bit. Everybody seems fairly alert, and I just want to end or move toward an ending. I could have talked about a lot of things about training and stuff, but the upshot, and a bit more about what I've done in Japan. So I've apprenticed with 5 boat builders and recorded their techniques and done drawings of all their boats. I've met and interviewed, sometimes very briefly, 52 boat builders in all from around Japan. Currently, the youngest boat builder I know in Japan is 72. He's actually on the tsunami coast, and the tsunami put him back in business. 90% of the fishing boats were destroyed, and since the tsunami, he's built 20 boats. And I'm hoping to raise funds to go back and document him, because I would think that the tsunami coast, I would think that tradition, because that tradition's been wiped out. In addition to everything else that's been wiped out, culture has been wiped out along that region. So I would like to document his work. This man lives on the tsunami coast as well. But I will show this picture to try to stress the unbelievable level of craftsmanship that's created through these long, arduous apprenticeships. That's a bentwood vase that he built. This man built fishing boats, mind you. Yet, in retirement, he could build a bentwood vase and he could build an inlaid wooden valise like that. He's also very interesting and unique because he's Japan's only builder of these. He told me his life's work was to relearn the secrets of traditional Japanese shipbuilding, and he has built all 4 of Japan's replica sailing ships. This one is in Osaka. That's a historic photograph showing that type of vessel. I happen to be staying at a museum where he was finishing his most recent ship. This was just before launching. and I had the privilege to be able to clamber all over the boat. The average age of the crew that worked on this was 68. Those are the only craftsmen he could find. And they built this it was 15 men, and they built this in 11 months. Wow. Yeah, that's good. That's fast. A view inside the cabin. By the way, we talked about the rudder, and so just like the small boats, the rudder, when you come into a shallow harbor, the rudder can be cranked up into that slot and protected. And that's the there's the crank, there's the capstan to crank up the rudder. And that's the rudder post right there. So that's in the stern under the deck. And this vessel, one of the most recent ship is actively sails. Japanese traditional sails were all vertical panels that are loosely woven together, not woven, laced together. And that was a very interesting technique. When the wind picks up, the panels open up automatically and spill the extra wind. And this vessel, his first replica ship, was one of only 4 vessels in this harbor to survive the tsunami. There were 53 vessels in this harbor, and they say the wave that came through was 35 feet high. And the ship and 2 other vessels were the only ones that survived. And this ship has become, this was a very hard hit. Ofunato, if you listen to the disaster, Ofunato, the whole city caught fire after the tsunami, and half the downtown burned, just terrible. And this ship now is kind of a symbol of, hopefully, the survival and reemergence of that community. This is one of the other boat builders from the tsunami coast. He actually passed away in a refugee camp a couple months after the tsunami. These were the fishing boats he built in his career. And I met him. I was told to go meet him. A Japanese maritime photographer said, "You have to meet Iwabuchi-san. You know, I think he's just an amazing boat builder." He built, working alone, he built 575 of these boats in his working life. You know, it really sort of puts in perspective one's own output and working life to hear something like that. You know, a rural craftsman in Japan, post-World War II, working in many cases, working 7 days a week. My Sabani teacher in Okinawa, the first day on the job, he said to me, "You know, we're going to work 7 days a week. You're good with that?" I said, "I'm good with that." And he said, "Good, because that's how I work." And I said, "Really? What was your holiday pattern?" And he said, "During my working life, my holiday pattern was New Year's and Obon. 2 days a year he took off." And we worked together. We worked together for 54 straight days. And we built our Sabani. And you saw the power tools we had. And when we were all done, he kind of elbowed me and he said, "You remember that ads I showed you at the beginning of the project?" I said, "Yeah, I remember that." He said, I used to make a Sabani in 42 days with that. So working alone, 42 days, working with me and power tools, 53 days. So that will put your ego right where it needs to go. These were, Mr. Iwabuchi, very interesting. These were his patterns. These are essentially his boat drawings. And he showed me these, and what you see here, you see sticks. They're labeled with the name of the cove where that design was built. He built a slightly different boat for every cove in his region. Okay? And there are 3 lines at the top, toward the top of every stick. And he showed me this and he said, because I asked him, "Did you use drawings?" He said, "No, I used those." And he said, "Do you understand them?" And he kind of smiled and stepped back. And I thought, test. And there was only one thing I could come up with. And the last time I gave this lecture, a guy got the right answer. 3 lines near the top of the stick. They're like the size of a yardstick. Any ideas? There was only one thing I could think of. And I looked at Mr. Iwabuchi and I said, "Well, Those are heights. You stick that stick upright on the keel plank of the boat, and the highest line represents the height of the gunwale at the bow, and the second line represents the height of the gunwale at the transom, at the stern, and the lowest line represents the height of the gunwale amidships. And his mouth just fell open. And I asked him another stock question I have when I meet boat builders. I said, "Did you ever have an apprentice?" And he looked at me and he said, "Not till right now." So sadly, I never saw Mr. Iwabuchi again. I would have loved to have worked with him. He was a really remarkable man. And this is the last surviving boat builder of the Tsunami Coast. He was not 72 in that picture. He was 66 when I took that picture. But he has built 20 boats since the tsunami. And these are his boats. A really, really incredibly simple 3 planks, bottom 2 sides. But I just think there's something so elegant about those. Recently, somebody sent me a photograph taken from that exact spot. And this tsunami completely tore up the concrete. It's gone. There's just gravel there. All the boats are gone. It's just filled full of garbage. But this is the boat I'd like to go back and document, you know, the last traditional boat design of the tsunami region. Yes?
I don't see any seats there, any thwarts except the one in the stern. Is it just a one-person boat?
Yeah, those are one-person boats. Yes. Yep. And you see a paddle, the outboard motor for those boats. Yeah. So these boats would go out again, spearfishing things, you know, off the bottom, sighting things on the bottom, and gathering them. I started with an image of Mount Fuji, and I end with an image of Mount Fuji. And so I'll take more questions. We can turn the lights up. Please take a business card where you can keep in touch with me via my website. And feel free to thumb through the book. I am the sole distributor of this book outside of Japan. You can find this in bookstores in Japan, but you have to get it from me. I just sent one to the Czech Republic, actually, and it reads with the spine, the traditional Japanese way. The Japanese reads from this side with the spine on the right, the Japanese way, and the English reads, so they read toward the center. But please feel free to take a look, and if you're interested in learning Japanese barrel making, tugboat making, that's great. You really need my book. So we can have questions, but thank you very much for having me. So, any final questions? Yes?
What's the traditional fiber in the boat building world in Japan for sails, for rope? You know?
That's a good question. They had a certain amount of flax, so there was linen, but they also had cotton. I'm sorry I can't tell you more about that. I'll tell you that the caulking, I said that Japanese boats are not caulked. We use cotton fiber for caulking boats in traditional boat building. The Japanese did have a caulking, but you caulked old boats when they started to leak. And you caulked from inside the hull instead of the way we do it, from outside the hull. And they used the inner bark of the cypress tree. They sort of peeled out and kind of bundled together those fibers from the inner bark of the tree. So when you said fiber, that's the first fiber that comes to mind. I'm sorry I can't tell you more about that. Yes?
This is not a woodworking question, but it's a design question. In the World War II films, the Japanese destroyers have a very much upswept bow. And I'm wondering, is that just a design ethic they have, or is it some seaworthy issue there? I mean, it looks very different from other destroyers in other countries.
Wow.
I mean, is that something? I mean, if you can't answer it, it's fine. I mean,
yeah, I'll tell you, Japan is so interesting in the way that it's a mix of the traditional and the foreign. So in Japan, you can find these incredible bastions of, traditional culture that go back hundreds of years. And yet, so in terms of like 20th century shipbuilding, the Japanese have always historically been very good at just finding who are the world's best shipbuilders and completely taking that technology. You know what I mean? I love telling this story. The Japanese Naval Academy is a brick-to-brick exact replica of the British Naval Academy. And the Japanese went so far as to buy the bricks from the same English brickmaker and ship them to Japan. So so when Japan opened up to the West, the Meiji Restoration and all of that, so when you talk about 20th century ship design, my thought would be that you could link that design to probably a European, but I could be wrong about that. But as Japan modernized, you know, I mean, true of firearms and other weaponry and, you know, automobiles and all kinds of things, there was always an initial, like, taking from that some other culture that they declared the best, and then inevitably making it somehow unique to, or adapting it to their own needs. So that would be my answer, that it's, I doubt that it comes back on anything deeper in the Japanese maritime context. I guess. Any other questions? Yes?
Just a comment, and I think Buck, you remember going to Martha's Vineyard and looking at a yacht sailboat under construction that wasn't a great deal larger than the sailing ship that was built within 11 months. The boat that Buck and I went and looked at under construction had been under construction. It was fancier. I think it had been under construction for 3 years. They anticipated another full year, had gone through 11 owners, and at that time I think it was $7 million into it.
Yeah, $7 million.
That ship, I know the price of that
so
ship.
Just as a comparison from...
Yeah. One thing that's interesting about the Japanese ship is, if you really look critically at it, it's quite simple. It's not a round hull. It's really just the small boats enlarged, you know? There are no frames. There are these beams that pierce the hull. So the panels go together in these large panels, if that makes sense. So there's a kind of simplicity. I don't mean to cheapen the craftsmanship, obviously, but there is a kind of simplicity that does beg or argue that those could be built faster. That boat, by the way, is 100 tons and 100 feet long, and it cost $3 million, half of which was materials. The other, basically, was roughly divided between materials and labor, even 50-50. So, yes?
You just mentioned material. This is all native material to Japan.
Mostly. I mean, all the boats that I built, you saw in here, all that was native material. This ship, I happen to know that they did get some Douglas fir from Oregon, and there's some Douglas fir. The backbone was Douglas fir from Oregon, and otherwise everything was native timber. You know, I know most people think of Japan as a gigantic city. Japan has the most unbelievable forest land you could ever imagine, with huge, huge trees. So there's a wealth of this kind of material in Japan. Yes?
How have they been able to maintain forests with ancient trees? We certainly can't do it in this country.
Well, yeah.
You know, do they have an active forest management?
Oh yeah,
program.
Yeah. And the other thing about Japan is an incredibly mountainous country, so a lot of it is just plain hard to get. You know, logging in Japan is a real challenge in general because the hillsides are so incredibly steep. Yeah, I mean, there's forest management. A lot of it, what I'm familiar with, is economics. That it became cheaper to buy foreign lumber than to buy domestic lumber. You know, because of that difficulty of extraction. So for a long time, during the real boom years in Japan, like the 70s, 80s, 90s, the lumber came from North America, Canada, Russia, Taiwan, amazingly, Taiwan, a lot of the temple construction where they need these massive cypress trees, a lot of the best cypress trees come out of Taiwan. Who thought? Does any of us associate Taiwan with old growth forests? But they're there. So, yeah, so there's a real economic reason for Japan's current kind of wealth of wood. Yeah. Yeah. And traditional Japanese culture was very efficient about using materials. That's really not true anymore, but you know, in the old days, I mean, scarcity meant that people used things wisely. People took care of things, houses, wooden objects. So, yeah. Yes?
All this wood just wasn't kiln dried, that's for sure.
No, no. Standard with all my teachers and all the boat builders I've talked to in Japan, 1 year air dried. 1 year? Yeah, 1 year air dried. Just that answer. When I meet boat builders, I have my kind of stock questions. What generation boat builder are you? Did you ever teach an apprentice? You know, and that's one of the questions. How many days off did you take typically? Tell me about your Shinto rituals. And that's a question, and that seems common from one end of the country to the other.
Doesn't matter the size of the wood.
No, no, no. One interesting thing about wood, since we're talking about wood, I find this really kind of beautiful and naturalistic. Wish I had a chalkboard, but if you picture a log, so Japanese boat builders slice that flat sawn, just straight slices through the log. The keel plank comes out of the center of the log. The two planks that join the keel come from the two planks adjacent to the center plank. The next two planks on the boat come from the next two planks out. I'm sorry, I keep doing that. So we call book matched, essentially. And, you know, on the one hand, that sort of fits sort of a Shinto ethic of using the trees symmetrically in the boat. My Sabani teacher in Okinawa insisted that all the planks, the butt end of the tree be at the bow. He said for shock absorption. Now, you know, if you asked a forest scientist that, they'd probably say that there's no scientific basis for that. But I've heard a lot of really interesting stories about, you know, trees from the south side of the mountain versus the north side of the mountain, you know, and boat builders picking those kinds of things. But that symmetrical use of the wood is quite interesting. And then I realized, you know, that does make perfect sense because they're bending such enormously thick planking that with the grain matching, those two planks are likely to bend symmetrically. So if you took a plank from one tree, as we would do in America, we wouldn't care what tree it comes from. You know, I could have 6 planks come from 6 trees. But in Japan, that sensitivity to the material, that's something that I had to learn and appreciate working in Japan because my culture didn't teach me that. So anyway, I've always enjoyed that bit of boat building. Yes?
By butt end, did you mean the part of the log that would be down close
in the
to
ground, yeah.
Well, doesn't that make sense, however, because the whole weight of the tree...
The whole weight of the tree, yep.
is on the bottom cells of the wood.
Yeah. Yeah, my tugboat teacher used an incredibly obscure zodiac to determine when you cut the bamboo. And you could not cut the bamboo outside of that zodiac. And that zodiac represents about half the days of the month. So it's a real problem, you know, potentially. And he had a belief that you only use male bamboo. Now, bamboo is a grass. It's neither male nor female. But he had this theory, and he had a way of identifying what he considered a male tree.
Maybe he knew something.
Well, you know, and then you get deep, and I got deep into it, and I actually came up with a reason why this whole thing made sense. But I remember after he died, I wrote to his widow, expressed my condolences, and she wrote me back, and she said, husband was in the middle of building a tugboat when he died. I don't know how I'll get it finished. Nobody can finish it. And I wrote her back, and I said, you know, it's the least I can do. I'll come and finish it. And so I was like, oh my God, I'm scrambling to get to Japan and finish this boat. And I wrote her a letter, and I said, I bought my ticket, and I'm arriving on the 19th of March, and I'll finish the tugboat for you. She wrote me back, and she said, that's in the wrong time of the zodiac. And she said, I won't let you cut the bamboo. And I said, Mrs. Fuji, this work with me, And what we had to do was I had to find a man on the island to cut the bamboo before my arrival within the proper time of the zodiac, so she would let me finish the boat. She would not have let me finish the boat otherwise. So, yes.
You don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but do you feel that your approach to boat building now is more spiritual than it was before you started this training?
No. I'll admit this. I'm very drawn to Shintoism. Shintoism is very simple. There's no 10 commandments. There's no laws. There's no right and wrong. It's just simply a belief there's a spirit in all things. And I like that because there's a belief, you have your favorite hand plane. In Shintoism, take that very seriously, that hand plane's your friend, that you work together. And in fact, in Shintoism, there's a ceremony in Tokyo every year. My wife went to attend it, where all the wives bring their used kitchen implements to this Shinto shrine, and they're burned. And what you're doing is you're thanking those implements for their hard life helping you. And I like that sense of it. You think of, I don't think of my laptop computer quite that way, but I do think of certain hand tools, and that sort of thing. So that's about as far as my spirituality goes. I guess I'm too much of a curmudgeon. But I think the way Japanese boat building has influenced me, and definitely those experiences have influenced me thinking about learning, really thinking hard about learning. And it's really, really fundamentally changed the way I teach. And I tell my students sometimes, I think the very best lesson that I learned in Japan was the very first lesson all of my teachers taught me. And the very first lesson, they didn't say it this way. They didn't come right out and say it, but they made it clear that I didn't know anything. Humility. And I see more and more how that's fundamental to learning. I teach classes, and people try to show off, and they take a class, and then they try to claim they know how to do everything, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's just so fascinating to me the way in which all 5 of my teachers, and of course teacher number 2, 3, 4, and 5 knew that I'd had previous Japanese teachers, which was for some of them kind of a problem, because you're not supposed to have more than one master in Japan. You remain loyal to one master your entire life. But anyway, that aside. But that notion of the first day on the job, there will be no speaking. And you will pay attention, and you will absolutely obey me, slavishly. It actually hindered my research, because I would say to my teacher, well, why do you do this? And my teachers will all say the same thing, because I do. And they were not interested in exploring reasons or ideas or concepts or anything. It was just, this is how I do it. And so this is how you will do it. And yet, within that context, it's understood that when you leave the apprenticeship, you go do whatever, you go innovate and do and become your own craftsman. In fact, several of my teachers specifically said that to me. At the very end, they said, now you must go away and go beyond me. You have to. You can't call yourself a craftsman and not want to do that. But I like very much that notion of when you come into this space, you're zero. You're a blank slate. Don't bring any of your ideas to me. Just pay attention to me. When I was at this barrel factory in September, the senior barrel maker is he's 84 years old, and he started with the company at age 14. 70 years making barrels. And the rest of the crew is in their 60s and 50s, you know, my age. So I was there for a better part of a day, and the younger guys and I were, you know, how do you braid hoops? I do it like this. Oh, we do a little bit differently. And we were trading things back and forth, and the old guy was just watching us, just watched us. And at the end of the day, he picked up his lunch pail, and he put his hat on, and he came up to me, and he said, I have to catch my bus. It's been very nice to meet you. And I just want to tell you that don't worry. After 50 years, you get the hang of it. And he walked out. Everybody here laughed. He was absolutely serious. He was absolutely serious. And that's the other thing that's influenced me about studying in Japan. I have to admit that myself as a craftsman, and it's sad to say I see my American culture of crafts, we're kind of ne'er-do-wells. We're Johnny-come-latelys. We came back into crafts with the Back to the Land movement or whatever. They talk about the revival of wooden boat building. But I don't know a single boat builder in America who's made 575 boats, right? And, you know, in Japan, you don't even call yourself a craftsman, shokunin, until you're over 60 years old. You don't even refer to yourself as a master. And it always, I cringe now when I open the Fine Woodworking or Wooden Boat magazine and a guy 31 years old is referred to as a master, right? I can't stand it. Whenever there's a newspaper article written about me, I'm described as a master. I even tell the reporters ahead of time, don't call me master boat builder. You know, and that's been a powerful influence for me from Japan. That notion of this is serious. This will take you 50 years at a minimum. So don't get too sold on yourself. So I'll leave you with that. I'll leave you with that homily. Thank you very much.
I hope that you found Douglas's presentation very informative. I certainly did. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And thanks very much for being here. Have a safe ride home.